It's important to care about what we put in our bodies. At the end of the day, we all want to be healthy, right? But what happens when the desire to be healthy turns into an obsession with healthy and clean eating? What if the idea of healthy food makes you spend hours upon hours in the kitchen? What happens when it starts consuming your every thought and stops you from enjoying time with your friends and loved ones? I'll cover all that and more in today's episode about orthorexia. Welcome to the Binge on Self-Love podcast. My name is Anna, and after struggling with binge eating disorder for many years and hating every inch of my body, I've realized that I don't want to spend the rest of my life feeling unhappy, hating every part of my body, and wishing to lose weight. Because life is so much more than dieting, comparing yourself with people on social media, or counting calories. So I've created this podcast to provide a safe space for anyone trying to heal their relationship with food, their bodies, and themselves. Join me every Tuesday on a self-love/self-acceptance discovery journey where I share my experience and talk to experts from all over the world. Disclaimer: this podcast talks about eating disorders and body image. Binge on Self-Love podcast is intended for informational purposes only. It doesn't provide professional medical advice, and it is not a substitute for diagnosis or treatment. Hello everybody, my name is Anna, I'm your host, and welcome to the Binge on Self-Love podcast. Before we start, I wanted to say how grateful I am for each and every one of you for taking your time and listening to this podcast. Your support truly means a lot to me, and I'm not saying that just to compliment you or anything like that. I'm saying it because I mean it. And with that being said, for a long time, I've been thinking about starting and building a community. An online community where we could support each other, where we could share affirmations, our stories, our progress on our healing and recovery journey and all that. And I would also love to have a place where I can connect with you guys on a slightly different level than this podcast, because this podcast is very one-sided, I would say. So I would really love to know whether or not you would be interested in something like that. That's one thing. And also, I would love to know what platform would you appreciate. I was thinking about Discord simply because it has a lot of features that could come in handy and it allows people in the community to engage, but maybe there are better tools. I'm not sure about Facebook group or Slack or something like that. So I would really love to know what you think. So the easiest way how you can let me know what you think about this community idea is that if you're listening on Spotify, you can vote and write under the episode section. And if you are listening on any other platform such as YouTube or Apple Podcasts, you can always DM me either on Instagram or TikTok at Binge on Self-Love. So thank you so much in advance for your thoughts and opinions. I would really love to make the community happen, but I first want to know what you guys think. Before we jump into today's episode, let me remind you that I am not a dietitian, so I've used many different resources while putting this episode together, and you'll find all of those resources linked in the show notes / the description box. So, what is orthorexia? The term orthorexia nervosa was first introduced by Dr. Stephen Bretman in the Yoga Journal article back in 1997. And if you're wondering what the term orthorexia actually means, like I was when I was researching this episode, the word orthorexia comes from the Greek word ortho, meaning correct, and orexis, meaning appetite. In an article by Jonathan R. Scarf, he defines orthorexia as quote-unquote an obsession with healthy eating with associated restrictive behaviors. An article on beateatingdisorders.org.uk refers to orthorexia as to an quote-unquote unhealthy obsession with eating pure food, and the food considered pure or impure can vary from person to person. So generally speaking, orthorexia is an unhealthy obsession with healthy food. If we take a closer look at orthorexia, Orthorexia nervosa isn't recognized as a separate eating disorder, but it is classified as an unspecified feeding and eating disorder in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is a diagnostic tool published by the American Psychiatric Association, used as a guide to diagnosing mental disorders, including eating disorders. And what that means in practice that orthorexia isn't recognized as a separate eating disorder? Well, it means that you cannot officially get diagnosed with orthorexia, and there isn't any firm agreement on criteria that professionals would use for diagnosing orthorexia. However, that doesn't mean that orthorexia isn't a problem. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that people cannot suffer with it. And it surely doesn't mean that orthorexia wouldn't be a form of disordered eating, which it clearly is a form of disordered eating. When I was trying to understand how many people may be suffering with orthorexia globally, it's actually not very clear how many people may suffer from orthorexia nervosa. Based on an article in the recoveryvillage.com from 2023, the estimated prevalence is between 1 to 7%, which is quite a broad range, and it may not reflect the reality, but the problem is that since it's not an officially diagnosable eating disorder, and it falls under the unspecified feeding and eating disorder in the DSM-5, then it may be difficult to know how many people actually suffer from it, and it's difficult to track. Now let's take a closer look at some of the symptoms of orthorexia nervosa. Just keep in mind that there isn't an officially approved list of criteria and symptoms, so it may be quite difficult to determine whether if you meet these and these criteria, you may be suffering from orthorexia, while if you don't meet these and these criteria, you don't suffer from it. Based on an article in the Institute for Optimum Health, orthorexia nervosa often starts as a desire to cut out foods from our diets that we consider unhealthy. Those foods can be, for example, highly processed foods or sugar or fried foods, etc. But what may start as a desire to improve our health may quickly turn into an obsession with so-called clean food or clean eating, gradually cutting out more and more food groups from our diet. Some of the signs that are rather typical for people suffering from orthorexia nervosa are paying too much attention to the nutritional value and the quality of food that you consume, which in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it, but keep in mind that we are talking about obsessive behavior. Another sign can be obsessing about the relationship and consequences of eating food and its direct impact on one's health. Fixation on health, purity of food, and eating quote-unquote clean. As already mentioned, it also means excluding certain foods and food groups from your diet, which can lead to lack of nutrients, drastic weight loss, and other health-related problems. People with orthorexia also tend to spend a significant amount of time thinking about food, planning food, preparing food. They may be avoiding social situations and avoiding eating out because they wouldn't have control over how the food would be prepared, and also they may be feeling stress or anxiety when the quote-unquote healthy food option isn't possible. For example, when you are attending some event or family gathering, etc. People with orthorexia may also label food as good, healthy, clean versus unhealthy. They tend to follow a very strict set of rules, and breaking those rules can cause them distress and anxiety, and also those rules may have a direct link to their self-esteem, which means that breaking those rules would have a negative impact on their self-esteem. Also, people suffering from orthorexia may have increased consumption of supplements, and they may include cleanses, detoxes, and fasting into their routines. These are just a few of the common signs and symptoms that people suffering from orthorexia may showcase. And like I've mentioned at the beginning, some of those things aren't necessarily wrong in and of itself. For example, meal prepping. I'm meal prepping all the time, and so many people out there are meal prepping, and meal prepping is part of their routines, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Just keep in mind that when all those things that I just talked about become obsession, that's when it's the problem. What's also interesting and what's important to mention is that unlike, for example, anorexia nervosa or a binge eating disorder, the primary focus of orthorexia nervosa isn't on the quantity of food, it's on the quality of it. And similarly, weight loss often isn't the main motivator behind the desire to eat healthy, but it's rather a consequence of malnutrition and of cutting out entire food groups from your diet. Now let's talk a little bit about the consequences of orthorexia nervosa. Why is it a problem? Obviously, orthorexia, like any other form of disordered eating or an eating disorder, stops you from enjoying your life and living your life in a way that you want. It's actually a quiet paradox that the desire to be as healthy as possible can actually lead to the decline of your health in some sense, mostly due to cutting out foods and food groups from your diet and not having a diverse diet and also lacking important nutrients, like I've mentioned. Orthorexia can also lead to drastic weight loss due to the lack of nutrients and due to sticking to a very strict diet rules, which can be very dangerous, and it can also contribute to developing an eating disorder. Besides physical health, orthorexia has a significant impact on our mental health. When you're struggling with orthorexia, you are following a very strict rules and you are obsessing over the idea of health and pure and clean eating. You're spending so much time thinking about food, worrying about food, stressing about food, and preparing food that you may actually not have enough time, enough space to do anything else, to focus on other areas of your life. Things like avoiding eating out, avoiding going out with your family and friends because you're scared you won't be able to eat some healthy option or something like that. All of those things decrease the quality of your life. Your self-esteem, like I've mentioned, is directly affected by how well you're sticking to the rules, which in my opinion is a very typical sign for a lot of eating disorders. And also, oftentimes, people who have tendencies towards perfectionism may see restrictions and restricting themselves as a form of self-discipline, which means that when they are following those rules, they feel self-disciplined. People with orthorexia also tend to label food as good and as bad, which can contribute to restricting the bad food or the food from the bad category, and I mean all of the bad and unhealthy in air quotes. And as we know, restricting can often lead to binge eating. Also, when you are eating food from the quote-unquote bad category, people may often feel like they are bad, or they may feel bad about themselves. At this point, I feel like it's important to highlight once more that there's nothing wrong with caring about what you eat and how it makes you feel, or what are the ingredients of the food that you eat. But it should never limit us or stop us from living content life. We shouldn't become victims of food rules and restrictions. So now that we've looked at what orthorexia is and what are its common signs, let's take a look at some of the tools that can help you spot whether you might be struggling with orthorexia. Let me remind you that there is no single universally accepted diagnostic criteria for orthorexia, but since 1997, when it was first described, there have been multiple attempts throughout the years to create tools that would be detecting orthorexia. Probably the most well-known tool is called Bretman test, created by Stephen Bretman, who I've mentioned earlier as someone who came up with the actual term Orthorexia Nervosa. The Bretman test was created in the year 2000 in the USA, and it's a set of 10 yes or no questions aiming to help you understand whether you might be struggling with orthorexia. It serves as a self-assessment tool. And there are questions like, do you spend more than 3 hours a day thinking about your diet? Do you plan your meals several days ahead? Has the quality of your life decreased as the quality of your diet has increased? And so on. I linked the test in the show notes in case you are wondering. And depending on how many of those questions you answered yes to, the higher the chance you might be struggling with orthorexia. Another diagnostic tool, which is based on the Bretman test, is called Ortho 15 questionnaire, created by Danini and others in 2005 in Italy. It is a set of 15 questions where eating habits are sorted by 3 main factors: rational, clinical, and emotional. Another tool called Eating Habits Questionnaire was created in 2003, but hasn't actually been published until 2013. It has 21 questions that are scored using a 4-point scale. And the last tool I want to mention is called Orthorexia Nervosa Inventory, created in 2020, and it's a questionnaire with 24 questions, again rating each item on a scale from 1 to 4. As I've mentioned, you will find all the resources in the show notes, and if you would like to learn more about these diagnostic tools specifically, I found an article published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, which was published in 2021, and I link it in the show notes. The article is called Prevalence of Orthorexia Nervosa and its Diagnostic Tools, a Literature Review. How orthorexia is treated. There is currently no standard clinical treatment plan when it comes to orthorexia. However, based on an article in National Alliance for Eating Disorders, the treatment of orthorexia is usually a combination of psychological treatment, nutritional education, as well as some kind of mindfulness training. But the very first step we all have to do is to realize and admit to oneself that you might be struggling with orthorexia, which may not be easy to do, especially when most people are interested in what they feed their body with. And I dare to say that health is important for most of us. So we really have to be honest with ourselves to determine whether the boundary between being mindful of what ingredients we put into our bodies and what we eat versus obsessing about healthy and clean eating and being a victim of this obsessive mindset around food has been crossed or not. Plus, let's not forget that we live in a society which, in a way, glamorizes and praises weight loss as well as quote-unquote clean eating. We are now more and more exposed to different marketing messaging like clean food, healthy and diet-friendly recipes, cleanses, and different free diets like sugar-free, dairy-free, etc. Which obviously, if you have a food allergy or intolerance, of course you're going to follow a certain type of diet that your doctor recommended to you. But I feel like oftentimes we see people jumping on a trend solely because they believe they'll be healthier or because they believe they will lose weight. Before we wrap up today's episode, please note that nobody should feel guilty for eating. Nobody should feel like them or their life is controlled by food, whether the healthy food or any other food or food group. Everybody should have a chance to live life at peace with their body and mind and food. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and I hope you find it helpful or interesting in some kind of way. If you did, please don't forget to share it with your partner, your friend, your family member, whoever you think may benefit from it. And also don't forget to let me know what you think about the idea of creating a Binge on Self-Love podcast community. I will be very grateful for your feedback. Thank you so much for listening today, and I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, take care and talk to you soon.